For 2 weeks, the gates at the airport in Kabul have been the portal to freedom and safety for thousands of desperate Afghans and foreigners. Tonight, they became the gates to hell. Suicide bombings have claimed numerous lives, including several U.S. Marines. So-called Islamic State has claimed responsibility. And Washington is warning that there could be more attacks throughout the night in Kabul. For their part, the Taliban have condemned the blast. Could they have prevented the blast instead? I'm Brent Goff in Berlin. This is a special edition of The Day.
It's a hard day today. As you know, 2 suicide bombers assessed to have been ISIS fighters detonated in the vicinity of the Abbey Gate at Hamad Karzai International Airport and in the vicinity of the Baron Hotel, which is immediately adjacent.
Nobody expected such a rapid and brutal situation in Kabul.
A barbaric terrorist attack, what looks like a series of attacks.
This is an especially despicable attack in a very, very tense situation.
This incident underscores the volatility of the situation on the ground in Afghanistan.
To our viewers on PBS in the United States and to all of you around the world, welcome. We begin this special edition of The Day with suspected terrorist attacks near the airport in Kabul. It is unclear how many people died when the explosions ripped through crowds of people earlier today. The Pentagon has confirmed that several U.S. troops were killed. It also announced that evacuation flights, despite the attacks, are still taking place. Now, so-called Islamic State, we understand, has claimed responsibility for the blast. But just hours earlier, U.S. officials warned of a specific and credible threat at the airport by a terrorist group associated with ISIS, known as Islamic State Khorasan, or ISIS-K. The Taliban, they've condemned the attacks. Here are the latest details that we have. One of the blasts was close to an entrance of the airport known as Abbey Gate, where crowds of civilians were waiting. Another was a short distance away near a hotel. Now, thousands upon thousands of Afghans and foreign nationals have made their way to the airport in the last 2 weeks in an attempt to flee the country following its takeover by the Taliban. Well, my first guest tonight is Matt Zeller, a former CIA analyst who has served in Afghanistan as a U.S. Army captain. He's also the founder of No One Left Behind, a charity that helps Afghans who worked alongside the U.S. military. Matt, it's good to have you on the program. There's a lot to consider after the events in Kabul earlier today. Despite these apparent suicide bombings, the Pentagon says that the evacuation flights are continuing. What's your reaction to that?
I can't see how they could be. I mean, at this point, they must be only taking the people who are still on the airport. My understanding is the gates have been sealed shut, literally welded shut, that there's ongoing destruction of U.S. equipment on the airfield right now via controlled demolition, which is usually one of the last things that we do before we pull out. We've been running the numbers here, and by our estimation, we're probably going to end up leaving behind around 175,000 people who needed evacuation.
Well, how do we have that number, Matt? I mean, how did you calculate that number? Because we've been asked many times, how do we know who's being left behind, how many people there are?
Sure. So the organization that I represent, the Association of Wartime Allies, has spent the better part of the last 2 weeks with about 100 data scientists working out of American University here in Washington, D.C., and the New York Times. They've scoured the employment records of anybody who worked for the U.S. military, the State Department, U.S. AID, anybody who was connected in any way with NATO or the international presence in Afghanistan for the last 20 years. If they could find an employment record, they've verified it. And what they've done is they've tried to do as accurate of a count as they possibly could. So we knew going into this that there were about 88,000 Afghan wartime allies and their family members. These were the interpreters who had applied for the special immigration visa. They were already on the books. But then in the last month, the President of the United States announced that the evacuation was expanded to include people who had applied for something called a Priority 1 or a Priority 2 visa, P1 or P2. The estimates there are just that. They're estimates. No one knows how many people have actually availed themselves of the program because they're brand new. So that's where going back to those employment contracts was so important. We had to come up with an understanding of how many people worked potentially for the international forces over the last 20 years who could not at that point avail themselves of the special immigration visa program. But now that these newly created categories were on the books, had a means of being able to get out. And so that's where this estimate comes from. The New York Times reported this morning that, again, we think the estimate total of the needing evacuation at the time of the evacuation began was around 250,000 people, around 250,000. The Defense Department has announced that they've been able to move about 105,000 people. Why we're bumping that number up to around 175,000 is at the end of July, Congress changed the rules of the special immigration visa program. They changed it from requiring 24 months of service to be eligible down to 12 months. And we think that that change alone might have basically allowed for an additional 25,000 people to then avail themselves of the special immigration visa program. They would not be on anybody's books right now or anybody's, tally.
Let me ask you, Islamic State has claimed responsibility for the attacks that we saw today. If that is true, and if they were able to get suicide bombers that close to the airport, how concerned are you that maybe they were able to get people with fake documents through the vetting process onto a plane that is taking would-be terrorists now to the West?
Well, let's be clear. Anybody who got on one of those planes didn't get on with a weapon or a bomb, okay? We did this type of evacuation in 1975 out of Saigon. And in a week, we moved 130,000 people all to the island of Guam, which is a U.S. territory. Those 130,000 people then stayed on that island while they were all processed. And one of the things that we learned was 1,200 of those individuals were people that we didn't want to enter the rest of the United States. In fact, we didn't even want them to be able to remain in Guam. So we took them into custody. They were put into a confined space on the island, and then their deportation was negotiated. We found other countries around the world that were willing to accept these people and take them in under the understanding that they would not be allowed to travel to the United States ever again in the future. That's what's going to happen here. Every single person who just got evacuated from Afghanistan have now they've been scattered to the wind. They're all over the world, but they're not just simply being dumped onto American streets or to German streets or even Qatari streets. They're all being held on military bases. Every single one of them is going to be vetted. Every single one of them is going to be. We're going to make sure that they are not a threat to anybody. And I've got to be honest.
Yeah.
The reason why you saw this attack today and why people should be concerned is because we trusted the Taliban with our security. A lot of people aren't talking about this, but if anyone who's been following Afghanistan, they know for a long time that nothing happens in Kabul without the permission of the Haqqani Taliban.
Yeah.
The Haqqani Taliban are the ones that look like the U.S. Special Operations soldiers that have been on TV recently.
Yeah.
They also have been the ones who took over security control for the airport a mere 72 hours ago.
Yeah.
One wonders, given that they've had historical ties to ISIS-K and that they've been the affiliate of the Taliban that have done most of the joint operations with ISIS in the past, and that they're now in charge of security at the airport, I really have to wonder how much of this the Taliban senior leadership actually have been caught off guard, and how much of it some of them might have already known about this. Again, nothing in Kabul ever happens without the Haqqanis. It'd be very interesting to see just how much the Taliban knew about this attack ahead of time.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Some people saying this could be the first failure by the Taliban to maintain security in Afghanistan. We will see. Matt Zeller, former CIA analyst and a veteran from Afghanistan. Matt, it's good to have you on the show. We appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
There have been several warnings of such attacks over the past few days. It's sad news to hear that this has now taken place. We don't know all the details yet, but we know the terrorists targeted people waiting at the airport for a chance to leave the country. All they want is to live safely and in freedom. And that's why this is an especially despicable attack in a very, very tense situation. And my thoughts are with the victims and their loved ones.
It was German Chancellor Angela Merkel there reacting to those attacks in Kabul. German officials have now confirmed that the country's evacuation mission is over in Afghanistan. The final plane left Kabul earlier today. More than 4,000 Afghans have also been evacuated during the German airlift, with evacuees being taken first to Uzbekistan and then onwards from there. Germany's defense minister said earlier today that the attacks in Kabul resulted in what is being called an emergency departure by German forces. All right, let's go to our correspondent, Nick Connolly. He is in Tashkent in Uzbekistan. Good evening to you, Nick. You just heard our first guest there saying that it's over for the evacuations, getting people out of Afghanistan by air. What are you hearing there where you are? I mean, are they expecting any more flights, for example?
Well, Brent, that military evacuation is certainly over. I think the decision has been taken by the German authorities to not put any more German service people at risk for now. But there has been talk of further commercial flights and negotiations, as has been widely reported, between German authorities and those Taliban representatives in Qatar are continuing towards that end. And then obviously there are the land borders. Afghanistan has hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of borders, not only with Pakistan, the place where most people have been leaving for, but also for Uzbekistan, where I am here now. It's about 600 kilometers from Tashkent to the Afghan border. Tajikistan, these are borders that people have moved across in the past. Indeed, people fled from Tajikistan to Afghanistan in the 90s when they had their own civil war. So this is the expectation in the region now as these weeks continue, that these countries are going to be preparing for an influx of people, even though they don't really want to admit to it now and don't really want to talk about it, and have been shielding these refugees in Tashkent from the press in the hope that somehow this might go away, but it doesn't seem to be.
Yeah, it's not going away, and the people are not going to go away. Do we know what happens to these people, these Afghan nationals, once they make it to Tashkent?
So the German government has rented an entire terminal of the airport here in Tashkent, and that's where the processing takes part. For the most part, it seems like the processing has been fairly swift, and people have been flown out on commercial charter flights within a few days. As I said before, we're not able to go there, neither the German side nor the Uzbek side, in any hurry to let the press in. But from what we can tell, people are being kept under relatively acceptable conditions. But I think these are the lucky people who managed to get on those lists. I mean, 4,000 people, some people say just under 5. It's a handful compared to the thousands and thousands who ended up working for German organizations over those years in Afghanistan. And lots of people now scrambling to make their way out across those land borders. I met people here in Afghanistan, rather in Tajikistan, who were heading to Afghanistan to try and pick up their relatives on their own, to try and get them out, whatever the price may be.
Our correspondent Nick Connolly reporting tonight from Tashkent. Nick, as always, thank you. When Germany's evacuation mission began, it turned into a fierce blame game. Opposition parties here in Berlin blamed the government for not evacuating German and local staff sooner and for ignoring warnings about the deteriorating security situation. But some in the government blamed Germany's intelligence service for not anticipating how quickly Kabul would fall to the Taliban. DW News asked German politicians here in Berlin a simple question. What would they tell those Afghans who have been left behind?
My message to the people in Afghanistan is we will not forget you. We see your suffering. We also see how the fight for our common values continues. Across German society, from the army to civil society, but also here in Parliament from many different parties, there are a great many people who have demanded that we rescue more people and wish we'd been able to do so, and I'm sorry that that didn't happen.
We must continue to assess what kind of support is possible in the region. In particular, decent accommodation must be provided for refugees in Afghanistan's neighboring countries. There needs to be a close look at why other countries managed to start flying out vulnerable people earlier, because there is a real possibility that the government failed here.
These 16 years in Afghanistan are the darkest chapter in Angela Merkel's tenure. This government bears responsibility for the the fact that people now have to be left behind. With decisive action, things could have turned out differently.
Well, my next guest is Roderick Kiesewetter. He's a member of parliament with Angela Merkel's CDU party. He sits on the Bundestag's Foreign Affairs Committee. He's also a former officer in the Bundeswehr, the German armed forces. It's good to have you back here on the program, Mr. Kiesewetter. You just heard those rather damning criticisms that we've been getting recent days. The evacuations started too late, some say they ended too early. How do you respond to that?
Well, thank you. Good evening, Mr. Goff. I ask for decency and humbleness to avoid any lip service, because those voices we just have heard, especially from the Green and the left, they abstained or voted against the prolongation of our Afghanistan mandates in the last years. So it's not a very fine sign of them to argue now in this manner. However, we need to be very careful. Our defense minister asked already in April to evacuate our locals from the north. And due to domestic reasons, we prolonged the whole process too long, too much. And therefore, we have not to blame our services. Our services argued very early, by the end of last year, that they see that Kabul will fall without any violence, latest by the end of this year. But due to the Googles of some ministries, they didn't want to hear this process. And last remark, the United States evacuated and left the green zone too early and without any coordination with its partners, and therefore they created the mess anyway.
The U.S. president has said that the U.S. cannot fight a civil war for the Afghans if the Afghan people themselves do not want to fight it. Is there a lesson to be learned there? And do you agree? I mean, do you expect German soldiers to fight for something that the Afghan people apparently are not willing to do now? Well,
President Biden earned or took the heritage of the Trump government, and he was wrong in his assessment because we underestimated that the Afghan government has had no support from the Afghan population, but we were aware about the corruption all over the country. Second, the Afghan security forces saw already weeks before the evacuation that the the American technicians left the Afghan security forces alone. And third remark, I see that we left the Afghan people, we left them alone in between IS, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and a corrupt Afghan government. So it was a mistake in our assessment, and it is not a mistake of the Afghan people.
But, Mr. Kiesewetter, how is it possible? I know this is being asked also in the UK and the United States. How is it possible that your soldiers were there in the country for 2 decades, almost 2 decades? You were with the Afghans, and yet apparently they are as strange and unknown to you now as they were 20 years ago.
I believe that the program, the whole process was wrong from the outset. It was a merely military program and not a comprehensive one regarding state building, regarding cohesion of the society, acknowledging that there are 45 different tribes with about 50 accents and dialects and languages. So we underestimated the separation, the partition of the whole country, and there was no comprehensive approach regarding the cohesion of the country and accepting as a kind of cultural awareness, accepting their way to find and to make decisions. The decision-making process of the Afghan society is not a democratic one as we are used to. We did not accept it. We just did not remark it. So we were only focused on the security forces, and our development policy was separate from the buildup of the security forces. So it was a lack of comprehensiveness. There have been many voices who have named this, who have argued with that, but we were not listened by our government. And we just prolonged the mandates instead of evaluating the mandates. And this was a mistake, not only by Germany, by the whole NATO. And by the way, it was a loss of the whole NATO system because it was the first Article 5 operation ever of NATO, and it failed.
Yeah, direct words there. Mr. Roderick Kiesewetter, member of the CDU party and the Foreign Affairs Committee in the German Bundestag. Mr. Kiesewetter, as always, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
An uncertain new life is beginning here in Germany for the Afghan refugees who managed to escape their home country. While they're now safe, most of their family members and former colleagues are still in Afghanistan with essentially no way to leave. Many are shocked that Germany has ended its evacuation mission, and many feel helpless.
Nabi receives messages from his family in Afghanistan. His brother is terrified and is pleading for help.
They don't dare leave the house. They're in hiding right now. They're alone and they need help. We should give them support and help as soon as possible. Otherwise, their lives will be lost. Their lives are in danger right now.
He tries to explain the precarious situation to an employee from the Berlin State Office for Refugee Affairs.
They should extend this, more flights to evacuate the ones who are really at risk and in danger.
Nabi is desperate and asks why more isn't being done. He feels he put his family at risk by working for Germany as a translator.
Of course, the German government has a responsibility to help us because we helped them in our country. And we supported them to complete the mission. Now it's time for them to help us, give us our hope back, to give us our families back. They should evacuate our families because our families supported us to run the mission beside them.
He's worried about his family back home, but officials here can only help him.
Well, my next guest is Lucas Wehner. He works for an organization that supports those Afghans who assisted the German armed forces during their mission in Afghanistan. Mr. Wehner, it's good to have you on the program. You know, a lot has happened today. I know you're in touch with people who have not made it out of Afghanistan yet. Have you been able to talk with them today, and what are they telling you?
Good evening. Most of them are very desperate right now. They are, to say, panicking. And the last days, it was really a humanitarian catastrophe right at the airport. Thousands of Afghans there. In the midst of them, our local staff. In fact, some of our local staff was mainly at Abbey Gate, where one of the explosions was today. And they have been especially now panicking. Where should we go to? What should we do, especially after the last planes left? So we're currently in the process of trying to track everybody down in terms of creating new lists of the people who were left behind, so that within the next days we are trying to implement our own procedures to get these people out.
The German evacuation, of course, has ended. What's likely to happen to these people now? I mean, I know you're trying to help them, but is it possible to help everyone?
Well, I'm not sure about everyone, but at least we'll try to help our local staff. And we have been in touch with still a few. Obviously, it was pretty difficult to reach them during the last days. Most of them stayed at the airport for quite a few days, and their cell phones went out of power. They haven't been able to be in touch with us. But currently, we try to get them out on a landway. And yeah, that's the main thing, how we help them.
I have about a minute left with you. I want to ask you, I just spoke with Mr. Kiesewetter. He is a member of the German Parliament. He's on the Foreign Affairs Committee. He said that the German mission in Afghanistan was a failure. What do you say to that?
I wouldn't say that the entire mission was a failure. I would say during the last days, our government hasn't really heard listen to us, what we had to say about our local staff. We had to rent own safe houses for local staff, and the government totally forgot about local staff during the last years, during the last month, and that was a failure.
Okay, Lucas Vayner from the Sponsorship Network for Afghan Employees. Mr. Vayner, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.